Alright, so here I have three separate annelids. So I have a polychaete, a representative of the class Polychaeta. I have an oligochaete or an earthworm from the class Oligochaeta, and then I also have a leech from the class Hirudinea. So before I go into the dissections, I'll go through the differences between each of these classes. So I'll start off with our polychaete. And so you should notice that this polychaete has a fairly well-defined head. It has a couple segments here that are enlarged, and it has these fairly hard sclerotized mandibles right here. So polychaetes have a very well-defined head. They also have what's called parapodia, or these fleshy appendages that look kind of like arms that run down the length of the body. And so these appendages aid in locomotion, so it can help this organism swim, or it can help it crawl through the sediment if it lives in a benthic environment. These parapodia also increase the surface area of the body, and so when these organisms are living in anoxic environments or environments with low amounts of oxygen, they can use that increased surface area to diffuse more oxygen into their bodies. So it's a dual functioning appendage right there. You also notice that these parapodia are covered in what looks like hair. And so these hair, or what looks like hair, are actually called setae. And so each one of these parapodia has a dense comb of setae along it. So this is the most basal group in the class, or the phylum Annelida. Everything else from here on out is much more derived. So if we look at our oligochaetes, this is the next step in annelid evolution. So you can see they really look nothing alike. There's no distinctive head, there's no parapodia, and there's no dense rows of setae. So these oligochaetes they do have a head, but it's not as distinct as in the polychaetes. So to figure out which side of this organism has a head, you look for this fatty structure right here. So this is the clitellum, and this aids in reproduction. But the side of the body with this clitellum that's closest to the end, that's the anterior side, front side. From there back is what we consider the posterior. So if you want to think about it in super general terms, from the clitellum up is the head of this organism. Its mouth's right at the tip here, and at the far end here we have an anus. I'll come back to the oligochaete in just a second, but I'll go over more external anatomy, and then after that I'll talk about internal anatomy with an already dissected specimen. So the third class in the phylum Annelida that we went over is class Hirudinea, or in the phylum Annelida, in the class Hirudinea. These are the leeches, and so as you can see, it's much different than these other two groups. So this is the most derived class in this phylum. So polychaetes arose roughly 500 some million years ago. Annelids in the class Polychaeta or Oligochaeta arose roughly 450 some million years ago, and then from there leeches rose roughly 400 some million years ago. So this is the most derived class that we'll talk about. And the major difference between these two groups and the class Hirudinea is that Hirudinea has these two suckers at either end. So none of the other groups have a sucker except for the class Hirudinea. These organisms, the class Hirudinea, do have a clitellum. It's just not as enlarged. And so the function of that clitellum is to create a mucus ring so it can collect the sperm of another individual and then pass it towards the oviducts. So this side right here is the mouth. This is the front side. This back sucker is used for locomotion. So there are predatory leeches, not all of them are free living, but the majority of the ones you find in North America are parasitic. So that's about it for the differences between classes that I'll go over in this video. If you want to see more differences, remember to watch that lecture video that I provided last week. So from here on out, I'll talk about the anatomy of an earthworm, so class Oligochaeta. All right, so I already mentioned the clitellum. This is this enlarged segment right here. So this creates the mucus ring during reproduction. That mucus ring passes sperm towards the front end, or the anterior side, towards the oviducts of this organism. There's a mouth at the very tip, and there's an anus at the other side of this organism too. So if we look closely at the mouth, if we flip this guy on its side, you might be able to see in this video, if I bring it a little bit closer, that the mouth is on the underside of a segment right here. So this, I have the teasing needle in the mouth right now. You can see there's a fleshy lobe right here that extends past the mouth. And so this fleshy lobe is what we call the prostonium. So that prostonium is keeping soil out of the mouth while this organism is burrowing. So while these guys are deposit feeders, they're eating soil, trying to get all the decaying matter, nutrients, and microbes. They're not always eating, so they have this prostonium to cover that mouth and keep soil out when they're trying to burrow. If we keep this organism on its ventral side, or the bottom side, you'll be able to see these two pores here and here. So these are the seminal receptacles. This is where sperm exits the body. So sperm travels from the testes through a series of tubes called the vas deferens, and then out into the external environment through this pore here and this pore here. So these organisms don't self-fertilize, so it won't pass, sperm won't transfer from the testes of this individual to the ovaries of this individual, but it will transfer to another separate individual. So there is a dorsal and a ventral side. You just saw the ventral side right here. The dorsal side is much darker in color, so that's when we can tell which side's the top and bottom. So you can see each one of these structures is a segment. The Phylum Annelida is the first segmented organisms that we'll talk about this year. Other than that, there's really not much external anatomy. You just have to remember the prostonium, seminal receptacles, clitellum, anus, and segments. With that, I'll bring over the dissection that I made earlier today. So from here, I'll talk about internal anatomy. So I'll cover a couple different groups or systems. More specifically, I'll cover the digestive system, the circulatory system, the nervous system, and the reproductive system of this organism. So if you look closely, you should be able to see some very well-defined organs, especially of the digestive system. So we mentioned the mouth, so food's going to be coming in through this hole right here. So if you look at the way I cut this individual, let me get this septa out of the way. The way I cut this individual, these two lobes here and here, that's one half of the prostonium and another half over here. This what you call it, divot right in the middle, that's where the mouth would be, and these two prostonium would be connected over top. Right behind the mouth is this structure here. This structure is called the pharynx, and so this acts as a pumping structure to pump food into the mouth and down the rest of the intestinal tract and the digestive system. Underneath all this material here is another part of the digestive system that I haven't dissected out, and so from the pharynx here to the next structure here is a small tube that runs that length, and that's called the esophagus. So food's traveling from the mouth to the pharynx through the esophagus underneath all this tissue to this structure right here. And so this is the crop, and this is acting as a storage facility in terms for food before it gets passed on to this next structure right here. And so this structure right here is the gizzard of this earthworm. And so this gizzard is grinding up that soil or that organic material that this earthworm's eating before it enters this next structure right here. And so this next structure is the intestinal tract, which I just tore open a little bit. So In simplest terms, food's traveling from the mouth right here to the pharynx, through the esophagus to the crop, gizzard, and then through the intestine, where it travels the length of the body to the anus here. That intestine is super long because it has to glean as much nutrients from a fairly nutrient-poor food source. So that cylinder runs the length of the body, but it has a fairly neat adaptation for increasing surface area. And so I've taken the liberty to open up this intestinal tract of this earthworm. And so this structure right here, so if you think about it, this was a solid tube or a cylinder running down the length of the body, and then there's this structure right here, this ridge that hangs from the very top, kind of like the tonsils in the back of our throat. So this structure right here is called a typhusl, and so once again, just increasing surface area, allowing for more absorption of nutrients, more room for enzymes to work and digest that organic material that this earthworm's eating. So I've dissected a little bit of the posterior end close to the anus, just so you can see that this intestine runs all the way down the length of the body, all the way up to the anus. So it's trying to glean as much nutrients as possible from this soil or this decaying matter. So the next system that I'll talk about is the circulatory system, and let me see if I can get some of this membranous material off of the pumping structures. So one of the most prominent structures that you can see so far runs along the top of the intestinal tract. So this structure right here that runs down the length of the body is called the dorsal blood vessel. So that's carrying blood down the length of the body, carrying nutrients, carrying waste, and all necessary things for this organism to survive. That blood vessel originates, let's see if I can get this one pumping vessel shown. So this that dorsal blood vessel originates right here. So if you look, there's this thin black structure here, there's one here, and there's one here. There's another one that's covered up, and there's the same thing on the other side. So each one of these structures is a pumping vessel or a heart, and so this is constantly constricting and then pushing fluid down the length of the body. So we would consider this organism to have a closed circulatory system. There's no openings, it's all kept inside capillary beds or veins. So there's a couple of capillary beds that you can't see. So close to the nephridia, part of the excretory system, which would be around this area as well, there are several capillary beds which reabsorb nutrients or water or anything else that it doesn't want to waste before that excretory system, those metanephridia, pump out that waste from the body. So the next structures that you can see are these really large tan structures here, here, and here. So these are all the testes. Those are producing the male gamete sperm. And so that sperm's traveling down through the vas deferens and then out through that seminal receptacle you saw on the earthworm earlier. So if we just line them up, the seminal receptacles are, oops, if I can get it right in camera. So the seminal receptacles are right here and here, and so that's where sperm is exiting the body from these testes right here and here. So move him out of the way, it's back center. The last system that you should know is the nervous system. So there's a brain and a ventral nerve cord that are very prominent in these organisms. So the brain is this really small structure right here. You can't really tear it out too much without risking just removing it completely. So that small structure right there is the brain. And so that's just this condensation of nerves at the very front where it controls the rest of the body's movement, what organs are functioning at what time, and stuff like that. And it's sending all these nervous impulses down through this structure right here. Let's see if I can pull it out a little bit without tearing it. So this thin white line, I don't know if you can see it in the video, but this thin white line is what we consider the ventral nerve cord. So this ventral nerve cord runs from the brain down the length of the body and branches off to each segment so it can control the movement of each segment or the organs found there. So it's located ventrally because any predator attacks that occur, such as a bird, are coming from the top down. So it has this fairly thick intestinal tract as well as the cuticle to protect it from predators. So this is a fairly expensive structure to make energetically, fairly expensive to make and maintain. So it requires as much protection as possible. So that's the anatomy of an earthworm in 16 minutes.